One of the earliest categories to raise alarm was weapons designed to overwhelm rather than stop. These were not conceived as tools of measured force. They were built to end situations instantly, without negotiation, without pause, without room for reversal. On paper, they looked like progress. Multiple discharges without reloading, rapid follow-up shots before an opponent could react. Firepower concentrated into compact frames that could be carried into tight spaces. But on the frontier, speed was not always an advantage, because speed removed judgment. Early repeating mechanisms, experimental volley designs, and oversized short-range firearms began appearing in the hands of men tasked with keeping order. At first, they were curiosities. Then they became temptations. A weapon that could dominate a room in seconds changed how its carrier entered that room. Voices grew shorter. Hands rested closer to grips. Disputes skipped steps they once passed through slowly. The presence of overwhelming force didn't calm situations. It compressed them. Arguments that once burned themselves out were suddenly forced into decisive moments. Moments no one had time to think through. Officials noticed something subtle and deeply troubling. When men carried these weapons, they didn't wait for threats to fully form. They anticipated them. And anticipation on the frontier was often wrong. A sudden movement, a raised voice, a door opening too fast. These weapons did exactly what they were built to do. They ended things. The problem was that the frontier still had to live with what came after. There were incidents that never made newspapers, not because they were small, but because they were impossible to explain. Entire rooms emptied of life in seconds, walls perforated beyond repair, bystanders struck without ever understanding why violence had begun. When investigators arrived, they found no hesitation marks, no partial escalation, just aftermath. And that terrified institutions more than failure ever could, because failure can be blamed on incompetence. Success like this had no scapegoat. It exposed something deeper. The frontier wasn't ready for weapons that removed human pacing from conflict. So testing quietly stopped. Prototypes disappeared. Men who carried them were reassigned. No public statements were made. The weapons hadn't broken. The system around them had. Another group of weapons raised concern for a different reason. They didn't escalate violence. They invited accidents. The frontier demanded constant movement. Mounting horses, climbing wagons, leaning against railings, working doors, fences, and tools in close quarters. Weapons that required absolute stillness and perfect handling were incompatible with that reality. Certain early firing systems were unforgiving, exposed components, unstable locking mechanisms, triggers that responded to pressure rather than intention. In controlled environments, they performed beautifully. On the frontier, they punished distraction. A stumble in uneven ground, a slip while dismounting, a sudden jolt from a startled animal, and the weapon responded instantly. There were cases where no one else was present. A man alone in a barn, a deputy loading equipment, a guard leaning a firearm against a wall. The sound was the same, a single report, then silence. Officials reviewing these incidents reached an uncomfortable conclusion. The weapon had behaved exactly as designed, and that was the problem. A tool that cannot tolerate human error becomes a threat to its own user. The frontier could not afford that, not when trained men were already scarce, not when every loss weakened order further. So those weapons were quietly removed from circulation, not banned, not recalled publicly, simply replaced. Because banning them would require admitting how often they'd already failed in the only way that mattered, by firing when no one intended them to. Then there were the close-range tools. Not firearms, not exactly. Weapons designed for encounters where distance collapsed, inside buildings, narrow alleys, cramped interiors where gunfire risked too much collateral damage. Bladed implements reinforced beyond necessity. Heavy striking devices optimized for a single, decisive motion. Compact tools meant to incapacitate immediately. The theory was restraint. The reality was finality. Once drawn, these weapons offered no spectrum of response. There was no warning shot, no visible escalation, no space to reconsider. A single movement determined everything. Men assigned these tools reported something unsettling. They felt trapped by them. If they hesitated, they risked being overpowered. If they acted, they crossed a line they could never uncross. Every encounter became a cliff edge, and cliffs make poor foundations for law. Officials began to realize that a weapon doesn't just shape outcomes. It shapes decisions before they're made. These tools forced confrontations toward irreversible conclusions, so they were never standardized. They were tolerated privately, passed hand to hand, carried by men who trusted themselves more than institutions trusted anyone. But they never appeared in official issue, because endorsing them meant endorsing outcomes that could not be defended after the fact. The most unsettling category came next: hybrid weapons, tools that blurred purpose and responsibility. Firearms modified with striking edges, long guns reinforced for use as blunt instruments, devices that combined lethal and non-lethal intentions in a single motion. These frightened officials more than anything else, because they erased clarity. Was the carrier enforcing order or delivering punishment? Was the injury accidental or inevitable? When lines blur, authority collapses. The frontier relied on simple narratives: clear cause, clear response, clear accountability. Hybrid weapons shattered that simplicity. After incidents involving them, no one could agree on what had happened. Witnesses described different motions, different intentions, different moments of escalation. And when responsibility couldn't be cleanly assigned, trust eroded. Institutions cannot survive ambiguity at the moment force is applied. So these weapons were quietly sidelined, not because they were ineffective, because they were indefensible. This pattern repeated again and again. Weapons that worked, but worked in ways that frightened those meant to control them. Guns that fired too fast. Mechanisms that tolerated no mistakes. Tools that made recovery impossible. Each raised the same silent question: who would take responsibility when this went wrong? And slowly, without announcements or trials, the frontier answered: no one. So the weapons vanished, not through law, through avoidance, through silence, through deliberate forgetting. And yet, some of the most dangerous designs were still to come, because the weapons that truly terrified frontier authorities were the ones that looked perfect, compact, reliable, devastating. They promised order through dominance, and they nearly succeeded, until officials realized what dominance does to judgment. That realization came too late for some towns, and just in time for others, because the next class of weapons didn't just escalate violence or cause accidents. They erased hesitation itself, and once hesitation disappears, there is no frontier left to protect. The weapons that erased hesitation were subtle. They didn't announce themselves with size or spectacle. They didn't look experimental. They didn't feel unstable in the hand. That was what made them so dangerous. They felt inevitable. Certain compact firearms, optimized for close quarters and rapid engagement, produced a psychological shift the frontier hadn't anticipated. Men carrying them reported a strange sense of certainty. Not confidence, certainty. The feeling that once a situation began to slide, there was already a predetermined end. These weapons removed the internal debate. There was no calculation of distance, no weighing of alternatives, no instinct to pause. They were designed for immediacy, and immediacy on the frontier was poison. Officials began noticing a pattern across different towns and jurisdictions. When these weapons entered circulation, confrontations shortened, not because people complied faster, because outcomes arrived sooner. Arguments didn't stretch. Standoffs didn't simmer. Crowds didn't disperse gradually. Everything snapped forward. Men reached conclusions before fully understanding the problem. And once force was applied, there was no path back. The frontier had survived precisely because hesitation still existed. Hesitation allowed tempers to cool, allowed reputations to intervene, allowed someone else to step between two men before history was written in blood. Weapons that eliminated hesitation eliminated all of that. There were internal reports, never intended for public eyes, describing a new kind of fear, not fear of criminals. Fear of deputies, fear of guards whose tools gave them no room to retreat psychologically once the situation began to turn. These weapons didn't just change outcomes, they changed identity. Men who carried them felt pressure to justify their presence by acting decisively. Standing down began to feel like weakness, and weakness on the frontier was dangerous in its own way. So these weapons were quietly rotated out, officially replaced with older, slower, less decisive decisive tools. Privately, some men kept them, and the stories followed them. Stories that never reached print. Stories told only in low voices after dark by men who had seen what happened when a situation went too far, too fast. Another class of weapons disappeared for a different reason. They created damage that could not be contained. The frontier was built from compromise. Thin walls, shared spaces, crowded interiors where everyone lived close to the consequences of everyone else's decisions. Some weapons ignored that reality entirely. Firearms capable of penetrating multiple structures without slowing. Ammunition that behaved unpredictably after impact. Designs intended for open battlefields, not towns stitched together from wood and necessity. These weapons didn't respect boundaries. A single discharge could pass through a wall, a second wall, and into a space no one had intended to involve. When officials reviewed the aftermath, they saw something deeply unsettling. The damage didn't match the intent. Targets were hit who were never part of the confrontation. Injuries occurred behind closed doors, out of sight, without warning. And once again, the weapon had done exactly what it was built to do. It was the environment that couldn't survive it. Frontier leaders began to understand that standardization wasn't about power. It was about predictability. A weapon that behaved differently depending on what it struck was not predictable enough to endorse. So these designs were quietly sidelined, not because they lacked effectiveness, because they produced consequences that could not be bounded. Then came the weapons that forced officials to confront a truth they had tried to avoid. Standardization equals endorsement. Issuing a weapon is not neutral, it is a declaration. It says this tool represents our authority. This outcome carries our name. This consequence belongs to us. Some weapons made that impossible. When a tool produced devastation beyond explanation, endorsement became liability. And liability on the frontier meant revolt. So instead of public bans, which invite questions, leaders chose erasure. No trials, no announcements, no official condemnation. Just absence. Supplies stopped arriving. Requests went unanswered. Replacements came in different forms. Within a generation, these weapons vanished from records. Not because they were rare, because remembering them was inconvenient. Hollywood helped finish the job. Not intentionally, but inevitably. Stories prefer clarity. Heroes prefer clean tools. Villains prefer recognizable threats. Weapons that represented loss of control didn't fit either role. They didn't make men look skilled or brave. They made them look overwhelmed. So they were left out, replaced with simpler icons. Revolvers that allowed time between shots, rifles that demanded distance, tools that suggested deliberation, even when violence followed. The erased weapons told a different story, a story where power exceeded wisdom, where technology outran judgment, where authority recoiled from what it had nearly embraced. Their absence reveals the real frontier, not a place of constant escalation, but a place constantly resisting escalation. A society held together not by the strongest weapons, but by the restraint to refuse them. The most dangerous frontier weapons were not outlawed, they were forgotten, because remembering them meant admitting how close order came to collapsing under its own tools. If you want to continue uncovering the history that institutions buried, the weapons that scared their own users, and the truths too uncomfortable for legend, stay here. Subscribe quietly. The frontier still has secrets it doesn't want you to hear. What made the forgetting effective was how ordinary it looked. There were no dramatic withdrawals, no armed collections, no public acknowledgments of error. A crate simply stopped arriving. A requisition form went unanswered. A design was labeled unsuitable without explanation. Men noticed, but they didn't ask. On the frontier, questions about authority were rarely rewarded. And so the weapons faded from daily life before anyone realized they were disappearing. Yet the fear they caused lingered because the men who had carried them remembered something the rest of history never recorded. They remembered how it felt to hold a tool that made restraint feel irrelevant. They remembered how quickly situations slipped beyond language. They remembered the silence afterward, the kind that settles not because peace has returned, but because everyone is trying to understand what just happened. One such weapon had been praised early on for its efficiency in confined spaces. It was compact, balanced, devastating at close range. It promised to end confrontations before they spread. And in testing, it did exactly that, too, exactly. Men using it reported that confrontations felt shorter, but heavier. The moments before violence carried an unnatural weight, as if the outcome had already been decided the moment the weapon came into view. Witnesses described encounters that ended before they could fully register they had begun. There were no shouted warnings, no gradual escalation, just action, and then irreversible consequence. The frontier relied on witnesses, not just to assign blame, but to reinforce shared reality. When violence happened too fast to be understood, that reality fractured. Rumors replaced facts. Fear replaced trust. Officials realized something critical. A weapon that ends conflict instantly also ends explanation. And without explanation, authority collapses. So the weapon was quietly removed. Another design disappeared for a more personal reason. It scared its own users. Not because it was unpredictable, because it was too effective at what it did. This weapon demanded commitment the moment it was drawn. There was no partial use, no warning posture, no way to signal intent without following through. Men who carried it began avoiding situations where it might be needed, not out of cowardice, but out of dread. They understood that once they reached for it, they would be responsible for whatever followed, and whatever followed would be final. That kind of burden wears on a person, especially in a place where the line between order and chaos was already thin. Officials noticed increased hesitation in men assigned this weapon, not because they doubted themselves, because they understood the consequences too clearly. So the weapon was reassigned, then shelved, then forgot. There were also weapons that never left testing grounds, not because they failed, but because the reactions to them were too immediate. Observers reported an instinctive recoil when these weapons were fired, not from noise or recoil, but from effect. They produced outcomes that felt disproportionate. Too much damage, too much finality, too little room for interpretation. The frontier depended on shared understanding. Everyone needed to believe that force was applied only when absolutely necessary. Weapons that erased that belief threatened the entire system. And so officials learned to fear success. A weapon that solved problems too efficiently created new ones faster than anyone could contain. This is why the frontier tested weapons differently, not just for function, but for psychology, for how they changed behavior before they were ever used, for how they altered the atmosphere of a room, for how they shortened patience, hardened expressions, and narrowed options. Weapons that accelerated violence were not progress, they were destabilizers, and the frontier could not afford instability. So these designs were never standardized, not because they were immoral, but because they were uncontrollable. In the only way that mattered, they took decisions out of human hands. And once that happens, authority becomes an illusion. What survives in history are the weapons that fit within restraint, the ones that allowed space. Space for hesitation, space for intervention, space for regret. The ones that did not force the future into a single moment. The forgotten weapons tell a darker truth, that the frontier came dangerously close to embracing tools that would have destroyed it from within, not through rebellion, but through efficiency, through weapons that work too well. Their absence is not a gap in history. It is a warning, because the Old West was not saved by firepower. It was saved by the decision not to endorse it blindly. If you value these quieter histories, the ones erased not because they were insignificant, but because they were terrifying, remain here. Subscribe and listen closely. The frontier still whispers about what it chose to forget. What made these weapons especially dangerous was not just what they did when used. It was what they did to everyone before they were ever drawn. Frontier towns were small ecosystems. Everyone watched everyone else. Reputation traveled faster than paperwork ever could. When a man was known to carry a weapon that ended encounters absolutely, people adjusted around him. They avoided him. They rushed conversation. They spoke less honestly. Not because they feared him personally, but because they feared the moment where words would no longer matter. Order on the frontier depended on friction. Slow conversations, awkward pauses, time to reconsider. These weapons removed friction entirely. They turned human interaction into a countdown. Officials began to see a pattern they couldn't ignore. Where these weapons circulated, communities hardened. Disputes didn't resolve. They vanished, along with the people involved. Silence replaced process, and silence breeds myth. Once myths take hold, authority weakens. The frontier could survive violence. It could not survive uncertainty about why violence happened. That uncertainty was the real threat. Some weapons were abandoned not because of a single incident, but because of what never happened again. No apologies, no reconciliations, no men walking away shaken but alive. Only endings, too many endings, too final. Quiet brutality became routine, and routine brutality destroys legitimacy faster than chaos ever could. So the frontier made a choice. Not publicly, not heroically, administratively. Weapons that reduced situations to inevitability were removed from official memory. Designs that frightened their own users were left unrecorded. Tools that made accountability impossible were never spoken of again. And over time, even their names disappeared. Hollywood never resurrected them because they didn't flatter anyone. They didn't make lawmen look brave. They didn't make outlaws look defiant. They made everyone look small, overmatched by what they had created. So history simplified itself. It kept the weapons that allowed drama, that allowed hesitation, that allowed a moment where someone could still choose differently. The weapons that remain in memory are the ones that left room for humanity. The ones that vanished are the ones that proved how easily humanity could be erased. This is what the absence reveals. The Wild West wasn't ruled by excess. It was constantly pulling back from it. The frontier survived not because it embraced the most powerful tools available, but because it recognized which ones didn't belong in anyone's hand. If you want to keep exploring the histories that were quietly buried, the weapons that scared the frontier into restraint, stay with this channel. Subscribe quietly. Some stories were erased for a reason. The decision to pull back was never framed as mercy. It was framed as necessity. Frontier authorities understood something that later generations often miss. Violence does not need encouragement. It only needs permission. And standardizing a weapon is a form of permission. It tells everyone watching that this level of force is acceptable, that this outcome is sanctioned, that whatever follows will be absorbed by the institution. Some weapons made that impossible. They produced results so extreme that no explanation could soften them. A body left unrecognizable. A room transformed into something no one wanted to describe. Witnesses unable to agree on what they had seen because the moment passed too quickly to process. In those cases, authority had nowhere to stand. No justification sounded reasonable after the fact. So officials learned to fear weapons that forced them into silence, because silence looks like guilt. Another reason these weapons vanished was simpler and more uncomfortable. They removed the need for courage. A frontier weapon was supposed to demand something from its carrier. Steadiness, judgment, restraint. Some designs required none of that. They allowed a man to dominate without skill, to end lives without facing them, to resolve fear by transferring it outward instantly. Those weapons didn't reward courage, they replaced it. And when courage disappears from enforcement, brutality takes its place. The frontier understood that distinction instinctively. It wasn't romantic about it, it was practical. Men who relied on overwhelming tools stopped negotiating even when negotiation was possible. Why risk dialogue when certainty sat in your hand? Why tolerate disrespect when you could erase it? That mindset spread quickly, and when it spread, violence stopped being reactive. It became preemptive. That was the final line. Weapons that encouraged preemption could not be endorsed because preemptive violence destroys legitimacy from the inside. The frontier did not collapse because of lawlessness. It nearly collapsed because of efficiency, because certain tools made control too easy, and ease breeds misuse, so the weapons were removed. Not with speeches, with indifference. Supplies redirected, contracts ended, mentions erased from reports. Within a few decades, even knowledgeable men struggled to recall details. Only the feeling remained, the memory of something that should not be repeated. That is why these weapons feel like ghosts in the historical record. They existed briefly, they changed behavior profoundly, and then they were gone. No monuments, no legends, just absence. And absence is rarely accidental. What survived were the weapons that required participation. That forced men to choose again and again whether to act. That left space for error, and therefore space for humanity. The frontier did not mythologize restraint. It relied on it quietly, reluctantly, because the alternative had already been tested, and it had been found wanting. If this kind of history matters to you, the parts left out not because they were dull, but because they were destabilizing, then remain here. Subscribe and listen carefully. Some things were forgotten because remembering them would change how we see everything else. Even after these weapons disappeared from official use, their influence didn't vanish immediately. It lingered in posture, in caution, in the way certain men chose where to stand, how to speak, when to leave a room. The frontier remembered what nearly happened. There were towns where the removal of a single weapon coincided with a noticeable change in atmosphere. Conversations stretched longer. Disputes cooled instead of snapping. People began lingering again in shared spaces. No one announced why. They just felt the difference. That alone was confirmation enough. Because if removing a tool could restore patience, then the tool had never been neutral to begin with. Some of the men who had tested these weapons carried a quiet shame. Not because they had used them, but because they had felt how tempting they were. They understood how easily responsibility could be replaced by inevitability, how quickly judgment could be outsourced to mechanics. Those men rarely spoke about it, not out of secrecy, out of relief that the decision had been made above them, that they would not be asked to carry that burden again. The frontier didn't survive because it perfected violence. It survived because it learned where violence became self-defeating. The most dangerous weapons were not the loudest. They were the ones that made everything feel finished too soon. That made people stop trying to understand one another. That replaced process with outcome. Those weapons didn't belong to heroes or villains. They belonged to systems that had not yet learned restraint. And the frontier, for all its brutality, did learn. Not loudly, not cleanly, but decisively. So when you don't see these weapons in story, when they don't appear on screen, when their names are missing from popular memory, that absence is the point. It tells you what the frontier feared most. Not criminals, not rebellion, but losing control of its own authority. If you want to keep uncovering the histories that were buried because they were too effective, too destabilizing, too honest about power, stay here, like, and subscribe. The most important stories are often the ones that were erased on purpose. What ultimately condemned these weapons was not outrage, it was unease. They created a feeling no frontier could live with for long. The sense that once a situation began, no one was truly in control of how it ended. Law depends on the belief that force is applied deliberately, that outcomes are chosen, not triggered, that someone somewhere could have decided otherwise. These weapons denied that belief. They replaced choice with momentum, and momentum has no conscience. The frontier tested many things in harsh conditions: men, towns, ideas, and tools. Most failures were loud. They broke, misfired, or proved impractical. Those were easy to discard. The weapons that terrified officials were different. They worked. They worked every time, and they worked regardless of who held them. That was the danger. A weapon that does not care who you are will eventually be used by someone who should never have had it. Frontier leaders understood that once such a tool was standardized, it would spread beyond intention, passed down, traded, misused, copied. And when that happened, there would be no way back. So they chose the only option left. They made sure those weapons were never fully legitimized. No endorsement, no mythology, no place in the official story. What remains is a frontier that looks simpler than it was, more restrained, more comprehensible, more heroic. But beneath that surface is the truth these absences point to. The Wild West was not built by embracing every new means of destruction. It was built by rejecting the ones that threatened to hollow it out from the inside, by quietly deciding that some power did not belong in anyone's hands. If you want to keep hearing the histories that were set aside because they were too destabilizing to remember, stay with this channel. Subscribe quietly. Some stories were erased, not because they were unimportant, but because they revealed too much.